Well, first of all, I wanted to mention that I had a lot of trouble preparing this conference, and I didn't write everything down, so I do my best, but I won't be able to do better than what I've actually written. So, was Annie Besant an agnostic or an atheist? Although Annie Besant never rejected religion as suddenly and as radically as might be inferred from a quick glance at the summaries that are often given of her life, in fact, a careful reading of her autobiography reveals that her deconversion took about 5 years, during the period that goes roughly from the moment when she rejected Christianity to the time when she converted to Theosophy. She has generally been described as an atheist by herself as well as by critics. Indeed, when she met Charles Bradlaugh and decided to work for him, he was the most notorious atheist of the time, and she didn't hesitate to join him in his fight for the secular cause, giving talks and writing books and pamphlets in which her commitment to atheism is ostensibly expressed. In her recent biography, however, referring to some of the articles actually that I wrote, Muriel Pécastin-Boissière has raised doubts about the exact nature of Besant's beliefs at that time, suggesting that she might have been rather an agnostic, taking into consideration certain passages in which she insists on the unknowable nature of God or ultimate realities, rather than on his non-existence. At the time, only a tiny minority of Victorians were willing to describe themselves as professing as radical a form of unbelief as atheism, which doesn't even seem to have been shared by a majority of the members of the National Secular Society. Did Besant seriously put God's existence into question at that time of her life? Was she more skeptical about God's nature than about his reality? Or should she still be considered as an atheist, in spite of the fact that the rhetoric of the unknowable is quite often present in her theological writings? I would like to show that she probably remained closer to Mansell and Spencer than to Bradlaugh concerning this question, although she always described herself as an atheist and never stopped saying that she shared his views concerning this question. So we could start with a few biographical elements before dealing with the question of the exact nature of Annie Besant's theological positions. During the years when she was a professed atheist, it is important to remember that, like so many Victorians, she only rejected faith very reluctantly and after much suffering, after a very religious childhood and adolescence. She writes, for example, that this is the typical Victorian crisis of faith, actually, which makes you suffer instead of giving you the feeling that you've been, say, liberated from religious superstitions, for example. It would have been more of an 18th century view, in France in particular, for example. She writes, "The path from Christianity to atheism is a long one, and its first steps are very rough and very painful. The feet tread on the ruins of the broken faith, and the sharp edges cut into the bleeding flesh. But further on the path grows smoother, and presently at its side begins to peep forth the humble daisy of hope that heralds the springtide, and further on the roadside is fragrant with all the flowers of summer, sweet and brilliant and gorgeous, and in the distance we see the promise of the autumn, the harvest that shall be reaped for the feeding of man." The language itself remains religious in this description of a rejection, or a loss rather, of religion, which is probably revealing in itself. Actually, Annie Besant was born in London in 1847 into a middle-class family of a mother who had Irish roots and an English father who had studied medicine in Dublin. Although he was apparently influenced by the ideas of free thinkers, his wife professed a strict Calvinism, which may have been at the origin of the contrary allegiances between which she was torn in the following years in the field of spirituality, although her father's premature death when she was only 5 years old probably prevented him from having a big influence on her. When she was a teenager, Annie was very attracted by Christian mysticism and by the most emotional, ritualistic dimension of the Catholic spirituality. Although such aspirations were certainly at odds with the ascetic Puritanism in which she was educated from an early age, however tinged with evangelicalism it may have been, they were not incompatible with the sensuous pleasures that the colours and incense fragrances of the Catholic services induced in her. I quote, "I discovered the sensuous enjoyment that lay in introducing colour and fragrance and pomp into religious services, so that the gratification of the aesthetic emotions became dignified with the garb of piety." Because she was very attracted by Christian mysticism, she even contemplated the possibility of becoming a Roman Catholic at a time when such conversions had become fairly common in the tradition of that of Cardinal Newman. It is therefore understandable that in 1867, when she was only 22, she should have accepted to marry an Anglican priest, although the marriage very quickly proved to be a failure, not only because she lacked experience in the field of love relationships, and because she was very independent-minded, or because of her rejection of women's traditional role, but also partly because she started to put her Christian faith into question. So what about her loss of faith? It was after becoming conscious of the Church's intolerance, as shown in Charles Voysey's trial for heresy, and after putting into question the literal interpretation of the Bible, that she apparently started losing her faith. In My Path to Atheism, as well as in her autobiography, she shows how, armed with an elementary exegetical rationality, she quickly managed to go beyond a purely devotional reading of the sacred text. Her unsuccessful desire to harmonize the last chapters of the four Gospels, having given the first blow to her own faith. Moreover, her growing skepticism apparently became more and more fueled by the philological and exegetical perspectives that at first developed in Germany, Annie Besant having read Thomas Scott's English Life of Jesus, published in 1872, in which these new historical approaches to the life of Jesus were summed up. She was also influenced by the scientific discoveries of the time, in particular by Darwin's evolutionary conceptions, and started putting her faith into question for this reason too. Besides, she was also influenced by more traditional arguments that dated back to the rationalist tradition of the 18th century, when she denounced the evils of religious fanaticism and started putting into question the alleged immorality of a certain number of Christian dogmas, such as the eternal punishment of the sinners in hell, or the atonement, the substitutionary sacrifice of Christ for redeeming man's sins, all of this having gradually led her to put into question the divinity of Christ and to renounce Christianity. The fact that she describes her spiritual evolution as having fairly quickly opened the way to atheism has something surprising, as this position, which finds its roots in the 18th century rationalism and deism, was still very rare at the time, particularly among the members of the middle or upper classes, because of its iconoclastic dimension and possibly even more because of its connotations of immorality. Another surprising factor that she also mentions as having had a major influence on her drift to atheism is her reading of Henry Longueville Mansell's Bampton Lectures on the Limits of Religious Thought, which had been published in 1859, such a reference being surprisingly being surprising not only because the author of these lectures was an ultra-Orthodox Anglican theologian who taught at Oxford, but also because this text had generally been perceived as having unexpectedly encouraged the development of agnostic rather than atheist positions. So I'm going to say a few words about agnosticism. Now, agnosticism in the Victorian period, which has been actually a very British tradition, and before coming back to Annie Besant's religious positions, however, I would like to mention a few characteristics of the British tradition of philosophical agnosticism in order to see to what extent Annie Besant should be considered as an agnostic, although she never described herself as such and never used the word, even retrospectively, in order to account for her spiritual and intellectual evolution. The term agnosticism has been coined by the Victorian naturalist T.H. Huxley, who used it for the first time in public in 1869 at a meeting of the Metaphysical Society. Huxley himself has specified that it shouldn't be merely opposed to that of Gnosticism, although he has acknowledged having this notion in mind when he created the term. Agnosticism can be defined as a profession of ignorance, as a suspension of judgment concerning God and supernatural realities. Unlike the atheist who denies the existence of God or any ultimate reality, the agnostic refuses to come to a decision concerning God's existence or nature. Because such a position is less negative and less dogmatic than outright atheism, which was still rare at the time and usually regarded as vulgar and overly negative, it was bound to attract many educated Victorians who, faced with an increasing number of arguments that challenged traditional religious views, nevertheless tried to preserve the possibility that some sort of ultimate divine reality might exist. What should be noticed, however, is that agnosticism is a term that's always been interpreted in different way. Indeed, the fact that specifically agnostic positions first developed in England can probably be explained, at least partly, by referring to the original religious situation, the fact that within the context of Protestantism there are many different churches. However, it would be dangerous, it seems to me, to put too much stress on the idea of a complete fragmentation of the agnostic position, such a perception making it potentially difficult to define the term precisely and to compare it with other forms of skepticism. For although it would be paradoxical to claim that agnosticism can be reduced to a single dogma, it is still important to make a distinction between a mainly skeptical and empirical position which considers that it might be possible one day or another to overcome the uncertainties that have been generated by the question of the existence of God, and what could be defined as a strong epistemological form of agnosticism which starts from the premises that such questions are by their very nature inaccessible to reason or empirical analysis, and that no certainty can ever be reached in the realm of transphenomenal realities. This first type of agnosticism consists in a purely skeptical suspension of judgment, the idea being that although I've had no empirical knowledge of God and have been unable to prove his existence rationally until then, he might still, at least theoretically, manifest himself to me one day or another. In this case, agnosticism has often consisted in a fairly unsophisticated philosophical option that's often opened the way to relatively light-hearted, cheerful forms of cynicism and disbelief. However, I would like to argue that it is the second position, which is based on an epistemological approach to theological questions, which has been the main characteristic of the type of philosophical agnosticism that has developed in Britain, although this dimension has almost systematically been lost sight of in our times, agnosticism having generally been reduced to a more or less traditional type of skepticism which simply suspends judgment on the questions of God's existence. So there are the origins of this agnosticism should be looked for actually in Kant, not only in the British tradition. And what I would like to put the stress on is that it is not paradoxical in Britain and within this tradition to talk of religious types of agnosticism, which are more concerned with the nature of God than with actually his reality. So, and from this point of view, it is fairly easy to make a link between these forms of agnosticism and a very old tradition of negative theology, in particular, or apophatic theology, that describes God basically as being unknowable, which insists on the idea that if God is to be described, he should only be described negatively. So I'd better skip some of that. So I'd skip that. So in Britain, the first theologian who developed the ultimate consequences of Kant's philosophy in a way that was both agnostic and apologetic and religious, therefore, was the theologian Henry Mansell, professor of metaphysics and moral philosophy at Oxford, whom Huxley himself had read very carefully when he was young. As surprising as it may seem, in a series of lectures on the limits of religious thought, the author drew heavily on Kant and the Scottish philosopher Hamilton, who had himself been inspired by Kant, whom he tried to reconcile with the British empirical tradition in order to give a new foundation to Christianity. According to him, it was precisely because man's mental constitution prevented him from having access to ultimate realities that he had to rely on the Bible, which in his eyes always remained the irreplaceable message that had been sent to man by an unfathomable creator. A very similar position was also developed and popularized by Herbert Spencer, who had also read Mansell very carefully and who became the patron saint of what may be called spiritual or religious agnosticism, which from many points of view only revived this tradition of negative theology that I was referring to before. So Spencer insists on the notion of the unknowable, which he capitalizes, he puts a capital letter and substantializes it to a certain extent from this point of view. So what about Annie Besant's position? In the general perspectives that have been delineated, if these perspectives are to be taken into consideration, it is clear that the conceptions that Annie Besant developed on the nature and existence of God, which can reasonably be considered as her theological masterpiece, it is obvious that these conceptions, her conceptions, had better be described as agnostic in the religious sense of the term than as being merely atheistic. Like so many of her contemporaries, Annie Besant was obviously deeply influenced by Mansell, although it was probably through the mediation of Spencer's first principles, which were published in 1862, that she first got acquainted with his conceptions, the very notion of the unknowable, the being capitalized with a capital letter, suggesting it. Besides, her repeated insistence on the mediating role of the categories of man's mind and her constant reference to the powerlessness of human faculties to apprehend God in a rational way have a distinctly Kantian ring that was obviously directly borrowed from Mansell and to a lesser extent from the Scottish philosopher William Hamilton, who tried to reconcile Kant with the British intellectual tradition and to put the stress on the idea that the mind could only perceive what was limited and finite, which presupposed the existence of conditions and relations such as space and time, spirit and matter, that were inherent in the perception of the world. This idea of a necessary conditioning of man's perceptions is also a recurring conception in On the Nature and the Existence of God. Besides, the epistemological arguments that she developed confirm that in the same way as Huxley, who says that he read Mansell by chance when he was very young, she apparently also used his conceptions for less than orthodox purposes and did not fail to be ironical about it. The fact that he was a clergyman, giving arguments to atheists. I've got quotations, but we'd better leave that for another day. I'd like to quote another passage, actually, which seems to me to be particularly revealing of this type of religious agnosticism that I was talking about a minute ago. She writes, for example, we know nothing beyond nature. We judge, this is the conclusion actually of the book, we judge of the future by the present and the past. We are content to work now and let the work to come wait until it appears as the work to do. We find that our faculties, epistemological questioning, that's what I mean by that, we find that our faculties are sufficient for fulfilling the tasks within our reach, and we can't waste time and strength in gazing into impenetrable darkness. Here, the rhetoric becomes more and more agnostic. We must needs find against superstitions because they hinder the advancement of the race. So this is more sort of 18th century type of criticism. But we will not fall into the error of our opponents and try to define the undefinable. This is obviously a very Spencerian phrasing, right, way of putting it. In this passage, the characteristically Carlylean injunction to do one's work and duty and to fulfill the mundane, day-to-day tasks that man has to perform with resignation and even willingness is explicitly linked with the more theoretical, epistemological question of the limitation of man's faculties, which is asserted twice. Besides the conventional denunciation of the enslaving power of superstitions, which is more characteristic of the deist free-thinking tradition to which Besant was also indebted, is immediately followed by a final denunciation of the error of trying to, I quote, define the undefinable. Here, Annie Besant's evocation of the undefinable was obviously inspired from Spencer's philosophy, rather, who, in spite of the fairly pedestrian dimension of his style, gave the strictly analytical prose of Mansell, whom he had also read very early and very carefully, a more lyrical, potentially mystical dimension. From this perspective, it appears that Annie Besant's religious theological positions during the years when she belonged to the secular society had better be described as being agnostic, or at least as having retained an agnostic dimension that was never negligible. Such a residual agnosticism of an apparently religious type having certainly played a role in her final conversion to theosophy. At the same time, one should remain conscious that admitting that it is impossible to prove in a demonstrative way that God did not exist shouldn't be accepted as constituting an ultimate criterion for defining an agnostic position. For in that case, it would also be necessary to describe the most famous atheist of the time as an agnostic, I mean Charles Bradlaugh. On the contrary, one should remain conscious that any consistent, properly conceived type of atheism necessarily has an agnostic dimension. But it doesn't mean that this so-called agnosticism should be taken seriously. In the transcription of a debate that took place in 1864, for example, Bradlaugh himself says that he never claimed that he was able to prove that God did not exist in a strictly demonstrative way. I quote Bradlaugh, "I wish before concluding to point out to you that in the position I have taken up, I do not stand here to prove that there is no God. If I should undertake to prove such a proposition, I should deserve the ill words of the oft-quoted psalmist applied to those who say there is no God. I do not say there is no God, but I am an atheist without God. To me the word God conveys no idea, and it is because the word God to me never expressed a clear and definite conception. It is because I know not what it means. It is because I never had sufficient evidence to compel my acceptance of it." Annie Besant made a lot of this remark, and she even says in one passage that she only decided to join the secular society after Bradlaugh had clarified his position about this particular point. However, there is little doubt that the agnosticism which Bradlaugh apparently professed remained much more formal and theoretical, that is, limited to a pure epistemological cautiousness, than that of Annie Besant, although she considered that they basically shared the same views on these questions. To conclude, I would like to suggest that in order to be able to talk of agnosticism, there should be, at least in the religious sense of the term particularly, there should be at least a real, sincere suspension of the judgment, and even quite often, particularly as far as religious apophatic types of agnosticism are concerned, a more or less mystical fascination for the ultimate mystery of things, which only seems to have been the case as far as Annie Besant is concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michel, for this really rich talk. And quite frankly, I'm really happy that you came to the same conclusion as I did, because I mean, you know so much more about agnosticism at the time. I'm sure there'll be a number of questions here. I'd like to start just with a question that I actually asked myself and I couldn't really answer. Do you have any idea why Annie Besant never used the word agnosticism in her writing as a secularist?
Well, it's not easy to know, but I suppose, well, obviously she could have done it retrospectively, but I think the term agnosticism, we generally say that it is true. Huxley said that he used the term for the first time in 1869, right? But he didn't write about it at all. You see, he just used it, and that was it. And I think that the term itself remained really limited. The use of the term remained really limited for at least another 20 years, when he decided to write 3 articles in a row because of a polemic concerning precisely this notion of agnosticism. Huxley didn't want his position to be, although there is a religious, spiritual at least dimension even in Huxley, in spite of that he didn't want his notion to be assimilated to the religious types of agnosticism that had developed in the meantime without his control. So the word was losing its meaning, and so he decided to intervene in the debate by writing 3 articles in a row, but that was already 20 years later, 1889. So I suppose this is the answer to the question, but she could still retrospectively have used the word, I suppose, but she...
Which she did not.
Okay, so this is... I haven't got any other answer. It's difficult to know, actually.
Maybe some... Yes, Kurt.
Yes, on this same question, in some of her theosophical writings, she does mention Huxley's definition of agnosticism, and she opposes it to theosophy under the idea of gnosis. So there's this opposition between not knowing, agnosticism, and then the gnosis, which supposedly theosophy brings. And it's not commonly stated in those lectures later, but I remember several, under half a dozen times perhaps, that she brought it up.
Okay, so
it would be worth footnoting something to that effect, I imagine. If you're interested, I'll try to help you
yes, please.
find the sources.
Definitely. So she used it just later on as a theosophist.
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions, please, or remarks? Yes, Massimo.
Yeah, that's just a suggestion. I believe it will be very interesting since some of the authors you mentioned were also influential on Conan Doyle to do a parallel how Conan Doyle from a period as an atheist, as a young man, went to spiritualism, and Besant from period as an atheist agnostic, we don't know, who went to theosophy. Because some of the authors you mentioned as a college student, young doctor, are also mentioned by Conan Doyle, and then of course converted to spiritualism, and we can say even Sherlock Holmes went from agnosticism to spiritualism in Conan Doyle's writings. So, of course, Conan Doyle was not a theosophist, he was a spiritualist, but I believe as characters who went from agnosticism to alternative spirituality, a parallel would be quite interesting.
Yeah, the way was pretty short, actually, from religious types of agnosticism to a return back to spiritualism. And I think that if you adopt this perspective, obviously it becomes easier to explain the apparently sudden and unexplainable conversion that she went through when she decided to become a theosophist. It seems to me that there are probably links. So obviously you can oppose the theosophy in terms of knowledge, knowing or not knowing, as you were saying, but I have read somewhere, although I'm not a specialist, that theosophy is, I quote, an omnipresent, eternal, believes in an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible. So it's not that far from agnosticism. I mean, you can understand. It makes it more easily understandable that she might have sort of converted back to another type of spirituality. Obviously, religious types of agnosticism were based on a criticism of Christian dogmas, the fact that these dogmas were contradictory, basically. But obviously, even if you accepted that, the possibility of adopting another type of spirituality that was sort of more abstract, saw things in terms of, I don't know, spiritual forces, that sort of thing. I think that once again, the shift from one position to another one remains fairly easily explainable. Easily is probably an exaggeration, but still, it becomes less difficult, this shift in her perspectives, or the apparent radical change that she went through, it becomes easier, I would say, to explain, to account for.
I perfectly agree with you. Once you understand that her position was more of that of an agnostic than an atheist, then her moving towards theosophy, appears as much more logical.
Yeah.
And for those of you who have not read on the nature and existence of God, which is really a great text, I think there is even almost a mystic dimension in the text, which is really surprising when you read this document.
Yeah, it is interesting because it's... Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Could it be that the term atheism was much more connected with political and social issues than the term agnosticism? So to identify oneself as an atheist was a social and political statement, and probably that was one reason why she did not call herself agnostic.
Yeah. Yes, I wanted to add that, but didn't have time. I told you that I had trouble finishing the... But I think you're right, yeah, certainly she wanted... The social aspect is probably, political aspect is probably another part of the explanation.
And I think we have time for the last question. Yeah.
I think another clue is the fact that Annie Besant, I'm sure we'll emerge on this again, she was an enthusiast. That's been a term that's used in a negative sense by some writers, particularly religious enthusiasm. And though the term agnostic and agnosticism in the 20th century emerged more and more, it's because we were moving away from exposure of ideas from the public platform, where it's it's easy to get across ideas if you're very definite and enthusiastic about it. If one presents an argument on the one hand but on the other, which is a more sort of seminar approach, and I think the key, one of the keys to Annie Besant's personality is whatever she pursued with this enthusiasm. And I actually concur with the fact that the term agnostic emerged as a later thing. But I think certainly if one reads people's responses to her public speaking and her writing in both phases of her life, that was the thing that captivated people. And the term atheism, of course, is a much more positive negative term than agnosticism, which is this more thoughtful and reflective term.
Yeah, and atheism was very much linked with a particular social class,
and radicalism.
Radicalism,
Yes,
political
yes.
radicalism, obviously.
Well, I think we have time to go on talking about this during refreshments. All right. So thank you all, and we'll be back here